Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today, here are the books that I've been reading over this last week. And I think whereas last week seems to have been a lot of shorter books by women, I think this week is sort of largely, it seems, big books by men. Partly because I started reading them the week before and I've only really now just started finishing some of them. But really excited to talk a little bit about them. So let's get started. First up, I read Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey. And so this is a winner of the Booker Prize formerly in 1988. It's sort of, part of this is me going back and reading the old winners and, sort of still part of my goal to read all the old shortlists. And I kind of just thought it'd be fun in the meantime, because I didn't have enough other reading to be doing, to read Oscar and Lucinda. And this is quite a sort of balmy book in many ways. It's sort of quite absurd and full of these sort of silly moments. But essentially the core story is that we have Oscar and Lucinda, who both, through various ways in their lives, come to become addicted to gambling. And they sort of find each other as these sort of people in the middle, kind of against the world a little bit. It's a really wild book in many ways. It's, although Peter Carey is an Australian author, it's sort of a very British book in many ways, in terms of setting and in terms of a lot of the characters, and particularly, a lot of the locations. It mentions Crystal Palace quite a lot, which is down the road from me. And so it's kind of, it's one of those sorts of things. And it's really interesting watching these characters interact with each other because there is this real absurdity to the book. It's full of this sort of ridiculous humour of, the theatre of the absurd kind of style thing. It's very, lots of odd things happening here and there and people saying sort of silly, funny things. But there are also these passages that are just full of absolute poignancy, which was really wonderful, I think, and came as a really pleasant surprise. I think the book itself just sort of does so many things. It's a long book, so you can tell that kind of story, but it has these sort of passages that are really poignant about loneliness or about kind of shame and guilt and recovery and all these other things. And it's kind of a bit of a sucker punch sometimes because you don't really see it coming. So yeah, I really enjoyed this, even if it's kind of not what I expected really at all. Continuing on a similar theme, Paul Murray's The Bee Sting, and please excuse the absolute battered nature of this dust cover for the book. I managed to spill a drink in my bag. It just kept on getting knocked against things. Not my finest moment. Anyway, this is in many ways part of the reason I wanted to do this one next is because there are a lot of parallels in some ways with Peter Carey's book, which is that this book is sort of full of absurdity and humour and what have you, but also these absolutely stunning, heartbreaking passages. I'm going to do a solo review of this as well, as I am hoping to do with most of the book along list. But this book I just adored. I think it's an incredible piece of work. So essentially the core idea is that we have a family who, in the wake of the financial crash, are sort of trying to just make ends meet, sort of just trying to survive in whichever way they know how. We have Dickie at the heart of it, who is the father and who is in charge of the family business, which is a garage. And he is, things basically start going wrong in every part of everyone's life, basically. So, we have Dickie where money starts going missing, it seems, and there are these sort of financial strains on him. There's a reputational strain. Things seem to be going wrong in the family, all of that kind of stuff. We have his wife, Imelda, and there's this sort of complicated backstory, and almost all of her passages are told in a sort of stream of consciousness kind of style. And at first there's a big wedge of it, about 150 pages, that is just Imelda. And, that's the length of Western Lane. There's a whole novel worth of Imelda in this novel. And I think at first I was a little bit overwhelmed by it. But the way this book slowly builds, I think, is exceptional. It's about 640 odd pages. And the beginning of this book, I was really captured by the voice of this book. but it starts to slowly build, and you start to see more and more going wrong, and you start to kind of get this bigger kind of cacophony of voices of all of the characters starting to have their part. And without spoiling anything, this book builds towards this incredibly tense end. I got to about page 500, and I was like, oh my gosh, I need more. But I was about to go to a work meeting, and I'm like, well, I can't just sit here and read the next 140 pages, although I really want to. I would, particularly when you get to the end of the book, I think it will dictate that for you. But I think this is a book that, because of how tense it can get, you do tend to read in big chunks, because it just kind of captures you and keeps you in it. I think this is masterful. This is kind of going right up towards the top of my my Booker long list this year. You know, this is, I think, an incredible book, incredibly tense, incredibly powerful, and really tender. There are some beautiful passages that I kept on sort of taking pictures of as I was going, just to kind of look back on later, because they were just so poignant about loss, or about family, or about grief, or about love. It was just so great. And it's fascinating seeing something be both, you know, have kind of elements of being a really strong thriller, but also a really deep book about sort of, you know, with sort of philosophical kind of ideas in it. A book that's really absurd and funny, but also incredibly poignant and sad. It does so much, and I'm kind of in awe of how this book came together, really. Keeping with the Booker, and a much shorter and quieter book, Sean Hughes's Pearl. And this is a book that borrows a lot from myths and fairy tales, and particularly sort of, you know, poems and nursery rhymes and those sorts of things. It's named after a poem itself. It sort of borrows from that, but it also incorporates lots of nursery rhymes. And at first it's quite, I found it a little bit sort of like, okay, where are we going with these nursery rhymes? But actually there's something really poignant, I think, about the way this comes together. So our main character, Marianne, is dealing with the disappearance of her mother. And, you know, so like already a very heavy topic, but the way the book sort of straddles young Marianne while her mother is around or has just left, versus adult Marianne, I think is so brilliant, that we have two different perspectives of various stages of dealing with loss, and particularly the kind of, the fact that it's kind of not really tied up neatly. There's no kind of sense of finality, or there's no conclusion. It just happens. And so Marianne sort of walks through the world without really having had it wrapped up neatly. She doesn't really understand what's happening. And so the nursery rhymes for me started really building this this really beautiful kind of contrast to what's going on. You know, these really sad things are happening. She's talking to the police about her mother's disappearance. She's trying to deal with that. And at the same time, these nursery rhymes are so silly and so fun, but also laced with danger. You know, so many nursery rhymes involve death and destruction and, you know, the most horrible things. And there's something about, I mean, I'm such a sucker for this, but there's something about the innocence of those nursery rhymes, and kind of the childlike view versus the sort of adult view. And I think this book straddles that really well at capturing both voices, and kind of, you know, the main character is on one hand incredibly naive and unsure, and on the other hand is incredibly wise and perceptive. And so I think I found this book just really fantastic for how it captures that duality of being a human and of dealing with something huge. Next up, I read Belonging by Amanda Thomson, a very, very different book in many ways. This is a book that talks about nature, and particularly talks about nature through the lens of kind of how you find identity and belonging within that natural world. So Amanda Thomson is herself a Scottish woman, and she is a Black woman who is also LGBTQ+. And so she sort of talks about the kind of intersections of those identities within nature spaces, and the fact that, you know, so she talks about how she is so fascinated by the way that we come to talk about certain parts of the land. So her former book, I believe, was a book, just sort of a Scots dictionary of nature, and sort of talking about all these almost lost words from Scots, talking about nature and these very specific things. Of at one point she details some of them in this book of that very specific time between sunset and the time you go to bed, or the time when in the morning when birds start to make noises, and all of these sorts of things. And so she talks a lot about Scots identity within that, about Scots and about Scottish identity within that. And so the thing that's so fascinating for me is how she then weaves them together into this really beautiful book, just sort of celebrating nature and the incredible things about it, but also through a lens of humans' relationships with nature. And so how her kind of understanding of the world, the Scottish dialect or Scots language kind of use of talking about the land, sort of shows something about humans in this really heartfelt way. And she sort of talks a lot in this book then about her relationship with family and how that all comes together. I just think this is a really beautiful book in so many ways. If you do get the chance, I think the audiobook is the way that I went, and hearing her talk about it in these beautiful ways and with this gorgeous accent, I think is just a really great way of understanding her passion and her love for where she grew up. And last but not least, another sort of lighter non-fiction book, ScreenAge. And this is by Fenton Bailey, and is a book that's sort of all about basically the history of popular television in some ways through the lens of, so it sort of functions as almost like an autobiography for Fenton Bailey, who set up World of Wonder, now known mostly for RuPaul's Drag Race, but for sort of various other things that he's sort of been involved in. And so it reads partly like his autobiography, but also an autobiography sort of told through television and through his career in television. And so we see how he talks about these sort of polarizing figures. So people like Tammy Faye, or people like Monica Lewinsky, and how those kind of people and the way they're televised and the way we tell their stories really matters in terms of also understanding humans. And I think what I found so fascinating was just how beautiful this is, just to hear somebody talk to you about the kind of the history of television through very specific ages. We're talking TV shows that wouldn't be made for ages, and then suddenly now something like RuPaul's Drag Race is huge and everywhere, and actually that platform means that some of these other TV shows can be made. And so I think he sort of almost sets out this argument of this kind of the character of the screenager, this sort of person who grows up with TV in this really big way. And so I think this kind of functions as a really nice history of sort of the US, and particularly sort of LGBTQ people in the US in a very specific time, but also kind of a wider narrative around TV and sort of media. And so I found this really, really interesting and very accessible and easy to read as well. But anyway, that takes me to all the books I've read this week, and it's been a fun one. I'm sort of back a little bit more on my book of nonsense. I think I sort of took a bit of a break, now kind of not racing, but kind of getting towards kind of reading them. I think now that the big chunky ones are out the way for the book, I'm going to sort of read some of the slightly shorter ones and finish it all off. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker, talking about books. Kelsey Breeze. Take care and have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.